Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Simon Cooper, your chair for this first event of today in the Festival of the Future City, part of Bristol Festival of Ideas. We'd like to thank especially Arts Council England, Innovate UK, Bristol City Council and the University of the West of England for supporting the Festival of the Future City. Now, if you wish to tweet, and I'll trust that you're not just checking your emails, please use hashtag FutureCity15. So this is the first of two mornings. The second one is tomorrow. We're talking about new thinking about cities. And what the Festival of Future Cities is all about is bringing to public attention and debate some of the new thinking that's taking place around the world. Now, unfortunately, Christiana Fragola is ill, but we're delighted to welcome Enid Slack, Director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the University of Toronto. Eva Gladek from Metabolic in the Netherlands will speak on cities, systems thinking and the transition to a more sustainable state. The next person listed in your programme has got the flu, so unfortunately we won't be hearing from Richard Sennett from LSE. However, we do have Brent Toderian still here from Vancouver, looking at what makes cities livable. Charlie Catlett from the Argonne National Laboratory in the University of Chicago, talking about cities and the array of things. But first, Mark Walport, who's the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, and he'll be identifying some of the key new lessons to come out of the Foresight Future of Cities work. So, Mark, if you'd like to come up and join us, thank you. You're welcome, Mark, please.
Thank you very much indeed. So why is the UK Government's Chief Scientific Advisor talking to you about cities? My job is to advise the government on all aspects of science, engineering, technology and social science for all of government policy. So it's sort of narrowly defined. So I have to work on the things that government cares about. These are the things that government cares about. They care about us, the citizens, our health, well-being, resilience and security. They care about the economy because our health, well-being, resilience and security depends upon that. They clearly care about scientific advice in national and international emergencies where UK citizens are involved. Politicians like their policy to be underpinned with evidence, although evidence is one of the lenses, the different lenses that policymakers look through. And clearly I have a role in terms of advocacy and leadership for science within the government environment. So why cities? Well, I think in a sense that's pretty obvious. If you look in the UK, if you look around the world, we're moving to a world where more than half of the world's population do and will live in cities. Cities are where our health, our well-being, security and resilience are turned into reality or otherwise. And cities, of course, are major engines of the economies of the world. But that, of course, is not to neglect the world outside the cities, which of course is equally important to our health, well-being, resilience and security. And a world of cities alone would be, I think, a fairly miserable world. So when it comes to underpinning policy with evidence, it's about looking in the short term, the medium term and the long term. In the short term, it is actually providing advice in emergencies. And of course, you can only do that if you think about emergencies. And one of the things the UK has is a national risk assessment, which actually, like any risk register, looks at the potential risks that face the country and categorises them according to their likelihood and their impact. In the medium term, there are plenty of issues around for science. Air quality is quite an important one at the moment, and the emissions that come from motor cars and other transport. And then it's important to look at the long term. Why is it important to look at the long term? Not because one can predict it accurately, of course one can't. But if you don't think about the long term, then there are different scenarios that might emerge, some of which are more attractive than others. And so you need to dial back from different long-term scenarios to think how you might make policies now that will have changed the likely trajectories, even though one is looking into the future through a glass darkly. So I want to introduce this session really with 7 lessons for thinking about the futures of the city, which have come from the Foresight project. And there's another reason, actually, for looking into the future, and that is that people tend to be very bound up in the problems of the here and now. How am I going to, if I'm an official, pay the bills associated with an infrastructure project or something like that? There's a lot of the present. Only if you think a long way down the track can you get past the immediate problems that you face. And so 7 lessons, this is the first of them. Firstly, there are different lenses for policymakers to look through. If you're in Whitehall, you tend to look through a national lens. If you're in a city, you look through a city lens, and of course each of us as citizens looks through our own lens. And of course, when you're in cities, one size doesn't fit all. Cities are different, they are unique, and that's one of the great strengths of UK cities, that they've been around for a very long time, they've been built over very prolonged periods, they have buildings of different periods, different designs, different costs, and that's a very good place to be. So national policy is best when it's informed by local circumstances and is co-created by working with local leaders. So, for example, national housing delivery has different local supply and demand realities. So there are empty homes in Liverpool, there's a shortage of affordable stock in Bristol. And the other thing about a city is that it's a unit size where you can work across sectoral silos. But if you think about cities on their own, this is the second lesson, you'll come to some peculiar conclusions. Cities are part of an ecosystem. They're part of a national ecosystem of cities and also the countryside, the towns, the villages outside cities. And so if you think on cities on their own, you'll come up with some pretty peculiar conclusions. And of course, that's an important aspect of central government, which it has to look at the system of cities, the nation as a whole. And so the Foresight project approached with a sort of systems of cities approach. The second thing is, and it follows from that, the third thing, is that you're pretty foolish if you don't integrate intelligence from different places. So if each city functions in isolation, thinks in isolation, and doesn't learn the lessons from other cities as they're applicable, then again, you're missing a big trick. And one of the things that we did as part of the project was to integrate evidence. We did over 20 individual city visits where we, in each of them, brought together the business sector with the academic sector, with local government, with policymakers, and you have a much richer discussion if you mix people up. If you only look through one methodological lens, again, this is the fourth lesson, you won't get the best picture, and so we commissioned a series of expert reviews, which are largely available on the Go Science website as they're being published. We did some future trends analysis, we did some quite sophisticated analytics, and the small figure there you can see of the country is about connectivity, emphasizing the fact that the UK road system was to a significant extent determined by the Romans. So infrastructure decisions have very, very long time horizons. They last a long time. And then we looked through the lens of different scenarios of what UK cities might look like in 2065. The fifth lesson is that the point I've already made in a way, which is that you get the best thinking if you don't have all the usual suspects in the same room at the same time. It's about mixing different groups of the usual suspects. So the city regional bodies with business, with national government, with public, with city governments, with universities. You got much better thinking. And we did seminars with young people as we went around cities as well. So in Birmingham, for example, we did sessions in one of the local academies. And then the very process of foresighting, if it's run well, is quite important because it is actually about building relationships that weren't there before. It's about building relationships across the silos, and that generates trust. And of course, people talk about trust, but the important thing about trust is trustworthiness. And so during the process, people demonstrated, because they worked together, they could trust each other because they were trustworthy. And so it's about building relationships as part of the foresight process itself. And clearly, as a scientist, it would be surprising if I didn't say that an experimental approach is important as well. So try new things, try different futures experiments, different ways of thinking about it. And these are some of the cities where we did experiments of different sorts, futures experiments. And I think people sometimes say, what's the legacy of this Foresight project going to be? And a lot of people have put a lot of work into it. And I think a lot of the legacy is actually the activity that it has catalysed in cities around the UK. So to sum up my introductory remarks, I think the challenge is for cities to take the leadership in thinking about their future. The people that care most about each city are the people that live there, that live around it. But if you are too introspective about your future, if you don't acknowledge that cities are not completely self-contained unit, that if you put a dome over Bristol, I don't think even Green Bristol would be self-sufficient if you put a dome over it. So we're part of a system of cities. It's one of our identities. We have strong city identities. And I remember very well when we went to Newcastle asking who will be living in Newcastle and Gateshead and Sunderland in 2065? And the answer came back, Geordies. But that begs another question, which is what is the nature of a Geordie? How will urban identities, and we all have many more identities in this digital era. So it's important that cities do take leadership, but they need to do it in a broad context. And equally, national governments have got to think about cities, but looking at it from a system-wide perspective. So a long-term perspective does matter. You're missing a trick if you don't use science and evidence. And the science of cities draws on all of the sciences and the arts as well. Cities are creative places, and one of the things that was said to us about Bristol by other cities is that Bristol is sticky, by which people meant graduates, people who come here tend to stay here. And then when we said, what is it makes Bristol sticky, we were told it's edgy. I leave it to you to interpret what edgy means. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. Well, an exemplar there for the format today, which is that each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, and then at the end of all of the speeches, we'll get together and have a panel in which you can ask questions. Now, should you find it difficult to remember questions for Mark and our earlier speakers, then Jasmine, where's our usher gone? Well, anyway, Jasmine, the usher, will give you a post-it note so you can write it down, or write it down on your own piece of paper. If you do write it on the post-it note, then Jasmine will bring it down to the front here, and we'll work our way through when the questions start. Now, we had a discussion about what order we should do things in today, and our next speaker was saying she should go last because money always goes last. And I was saying, well, no, let's have you second, because money is so important to making all of the ideas that we may have about cities. There's no shortage of ideas about cities, although, as Sir Mark said, you need to test them scientifically to make sure they're good ideas. There's no shortage of ideas, but there's definitely, I think, we all feel a shortage of money. So please welcome onto the stage Enid Slack, who's Director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the University of Toronto, and she's going to talk about funding future cities. Enid.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. We did indeed have this discussion. Usually when people have visions for cities, we like to hear these wonderful ideas, and I'm the person who comes in at the end and says, yeah, but how are you going to pay for it? And then it's a real downer for everybody. So I think Simon just wanted to get that out of the way early so we could get on to the vision thing. Also, Brent spoke last night, and as I recall, he said, and I hope I get this right, economists would be the last people he would go to for ideas about quality of life in the city. And being an economist, I think I will stay away from anything about quality of life. And I will talk about funding. So we were asked, as part of our remarks, to answer this question. What's the one thing that will be different in the city of 2025 as a result of your approach? What, in other words, do you want to see happen? And I guess I would answer that very briefly by saying I would like to see cities that are able to pay for the services and infrastructure that people want. That would mean less wrangling about how we're going to pay for service, less complaining, less begging to other levels of government. In short, I would like to see cities with more fiscal autonomy, more control over their own destiny. So the question is, what approach? How do we get there? And I'm going to suggest three things. The first is I think we have to link revenues with expenditures. We don't start with revenues. We don't start with money. We start with what is it we want to have in our cities? What services, what infrastructure do we want to have? And when we do look around the world, we find that people are more likely to support tax increases if they can see what they're getting for their money. An example we can take from the U.S., where they often hold ballot initiatives, or we would call them referenda, to raise the sales tax 1% or to raise property taxes, to pay for specific transit improvements or to pay for libraries. And these referenda have to be passed with a 70% majority in many cases, and they do pass. And they pass because people understand that the money isn't going to Washington, D.C., it's not going to the state capital, but it's staying in their community for local improvements that they can see. Now, I'm not saying that's the way we should fund cities with referenda, quite on the contrary. But I do think it highlights that people are more willing to pay taxes if they actually see they're getting something for them. But I also want to link revenues and expenditures in a different way, and that's to say that the way we pay for services really depends on the kinds of services we're providing. Cities deliver a wide range of services that have different characteristics, and that they should be paid for in different ways. Let me give you an example of, I call them 4 buckets. In the first bucket, we have services that are like private goods. These are things where we can identify the beneficiaries, and we can exclude people who don't pay. These are things like water, transit, garbage, waste collection and disposal. So these are areas where we can charge user fees, perhaps not 100%. There may be reasons why we don't want to do that. But these kinds of services lend themselves to charging. And then people say how much water they want, because if we don't charge for the use of water, people will use a lot of water, perhaps much more than they need. They'll leave their taps running, they'll wash their cars too often. And so if we charge for water, we can actually get a more, what we'd say in economics, optimal use of water. So the first bucket are services that are private in nature, and I think user fees are the most appropriate. The second group, or the second bucket, are public goods. We know people benefit from these goods, but we can't identify the individuals who benefit. So we're talking perhaps about policing, parks, street lighting. So these are services where we can't charge user fees for. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. But that's where a property tax or perhaps a sales tax would be appropriate. Property tax in particular, because a lot of these services enhance the value of properties, and so it makes sense to perhaps charge on the property tax. The third bucket are services that have a redistributive component in them. So things like social assistance or social housing, where we are trying to just redistribute money from the high-income population to the low-income population. And so there, the income tax is the best tax. It's certainly better than a property tax. It's a much more progressive tax. If we're trying to redistribute, we want to use the most progressive tax. So that's where an income tax would fit in. And the last group are services where the benefits spill over municipal boundaries. So if you're building a road in your local authority, people in neighboring authorities are also going to benefit from the use of that road. Well, you don't want to pay for it all yourselves because other people are benefiting. And so how do you get that one local authority to build the bigger road that's needed for perhaps 3 or 4 municipalities? And one way to do that is to have a transfer from a senior level of government. So it might say, well, 30% of the benefits of that road spill over your boundaries. We'll pick up 30%, you pick up 70% of the cost. So 4 buckets of services with different characteristics, different ways of paying for them. Now, some services are going to appear in more than one of those buckets. So you might have social assistance in the redistributive bucket, but it also has spillover elements. So it's not a perfect graph, but it gives you an idea that different kinds of services should be paid for in different ways. So that's the first thing, linking revenues and expenditures. The second that flows from that is that local authorities need a mix of taxes to do their job. Firstly, because, as I said, they provide a range of expenditures that call for different types of revenues. They also, by having a mix of taxes, can tax services used by commuters and visitors. So if you're just levying a property tax or a council tax, as you call it here, that's being paid for by people who live here. But if somebody's coming from another municipality, another local authority, to work in this municipality, they go home and pay taxes where they live. They're using services in the place where they work, but they're not paying for them. Some revenues grow with the economy, income taxes, sales taxes. As the economy is doing well, those revenues continue to increase. Property taxes, particularly the way they're levied here, don't increase with the economy. And lastly, a mix of taxes gives local governments some flexibility to deal with different circumstances. They're not relying on just one tax to do everything. So linking revenues and expenditures, having a mix of taxes. The third thing is local autonomy. And by that, when I say local authorities should have a mix of taxes, I don't mean they should be taking the taxes of the central government. I'm saying that they should be setting their own tax rates and be responsible and accountable to taxpayers. So in this model, local governments would say, these are the services we want to provide. This is what you, the people, have asked us for. And we're going to raise these taxes in this way to pay for them. We will be accountable for what we are providing and the taxes we are levying. So that doesn't mean no dependence on transfers from the central government, but it does mean less dependence so that cities have the ability to control their own destiny. So I hope that wasn't a downer on the funding right off at the beginning, but perhaps some ideas about what I would like to see for the future of cities in terms of funding. Thank you.
Fascinating, thank you. I think funding is something that gives us all sleepless nights occasionally, and perhaps more frequently now than before. So thank you for that insight. Now, we move on now to Eva Gladek, who joins us from Metabolic in the Netherlands. One of Sir Mark's 7 points was to think in a systems manner about cities, and that's what Eva's going to talk about, systems thinking and the transition to a more sustainable state. Now, I know you have to press a button here, so I'll just stand back and let you do that.
Well, good morning, everyone. And indeed, I am going to talk about how systems thinking applies to cities, but I'm going to do that through the perspective of some applied urban transformation projects that Metabolic has been doing in the city of Amsterdam. So my talk is called Urban Metabolisms and Circular Cities, and that has to do with taking a systemic perspective of the metabolism of a city and figuring out how to transition it to a circular state, and that comes from the circular economy approach. I am going to actually speak only about 2 projects. I originally wanted to do 3 because I thought I had 15 minutes, but I will I will try to make it faster. So Metabolic is a unique kind of company. I want to say a little bit about it so that you understand why we do the kind of work that I'm going to talk about. We are a systems consulting and clean tech development firm. And our overall mission as a company is to transition the world to a sustainable state as quickly as possible. We have 2 locations, one in Amsterdam and one in Kingston, Jamaica. And the company itself is structured out of 3 interlinking divisions. So in the first division, our consulting division, we do a lot of systems analysis. We try to understand the state of the world and where the leverage points are, so where you can actually intervene to change things as effectively as possible. This picture is, it shows the entire global material flow for the year 2010, so everything that was extracted everywhere on the planet. And then you can see on the very right over there, that very small green line is what was recycled in 2010. So you start to understand, by looking at these pictures, you can start to see where the biggest areas of problems or interventions are. The next division that we have is our technologies division. So we actually look at the global system and see where to intervene and then develop solutions that are scalable. So this is actually what we call the solar transformer. It's basically, it replaces a diesel generator with solar power and a battery and a peak shaver system. And we developed that as part of our approach towards transitioning towards renewable power. And then in our ventures division, our goal is to actually spin off new companies and organizations. So this is Metabolic Lab, our experimental showcase facility, which is operating as its own sort of business and showing how urban material cycles can be closed. And I wanted to say this because the origin of Metabolic was in my desire to actually move away from just advisory work and do implementation work. And that's why we have these three divisions where we take large-scale theory and do all of this complex analysis, but then we bring it back down to really applied projects. And overall, when we're looking at the global system, since we're trying to transition it to a sustainable state as quickly as possible, we try to be very systematic about where we intervene. When I was in university, I first ran across this set of pictures. They're all exponential growth hockey stick curves, and they show a lot of key parameters that are critical for human well-being and actually the continued functioning of the biosphere. So you can see loss of global biodiversity, increase in consumption of various resources, and everything since around 1950 has been going on an exponentially increasing growth curve. And one of the key things is that it's not just one parameter that's increasing on this scale, it's everything, because all of these issues are interlinked. It's a system. And so within the company, we always think about, okay, where can we possibly intervene in such a massively interlinking set of problems? And that is actually why we ended up focusing with one of our major focal areas is cities. You've already heard quite some statistics about this, I'm sure. Here you can see a slum encroaching upon a main sort of city center. The growth of cities is proceeding at a very rapid pace, but cities also have a very unique set of properties and a role as a global leverage point. So, for example, these statistics I think are quite striking. They only occupy 3% of global land area, but are responsible indeed for most economic activity, so 80% of GDP and 90% of innovation. And indeed, they consume and produce most waste and consume most resources. So 75% of natural resources are attributable to cities, and 60 to 80% of global greenhouse gases, and a majority of waste as well. The reason this is so interesting is that this is the definition of a leverage point. If you can figure out how to transform a city or how to transform how cities are structured and function, then you can, in principle, change those hockey stick curves that I just showed, change the pattern that they're on, because you're actually transitioning the model upon which the economy is functioning. So we decided to actually start working on transitioning cities from this high level of looking at them as a system and doing a lot of analysis, but then intervening on the ground and actually starting up projects. So one of our first projects in Amsterdam North, which has become sort of our playground for urban transformation, was something called De Keuvel. The basic idea behind it is it's a polluted plot of land. It was a brownfield, which had formerly been a shipyard, and the city owned the land and said, okay, well, we can't do much with this property at the moment. Does anyone have an idea for how to beneficially reuse this wasteland for the next 10 years? And they had a very small budget, around 250,000 euros, to support the development of some kind of program there. And a group of architects came up with the idea to use phytoremediation, so plants to clean the polluted soil, to use old houseboats, of which there are many in Amsterdam, to actually use whole buildings and put them on land to recycle them. And then that way you have a very light footprint development. So lots of light infrastructure, these removable buildings for the 10-year period. So we got involved very early on in this project as the sustainability advisors, and because the site, part of the tender from the municipality was also stipulated that the site had to be as sustainable as possible, so it had to hit various sustainability criteria. And our fantasy was to really design it in such a way that it would be a circular neighborhood, an example of how you could really close all the material cycles and move to fully renewable resource use. And so we did we conducted a long process of stakeholder work and analyzing the site and really looking at it from a systems perspective to design this theoretical resource flow on the location, and also come up with plans for how to actually retrofit all of these buildings. This was the artist's render of what the site should look like once it was completed. And I'm happy to say that from drone pictures that we've taken now, it does look somewhat like this. So very soon after we finished the study, we were confronted with the first moment moment of having to transition from actually being a sort of theoretical consulting bureau to really implementing things. And this was one of the most exciting periods of my life, because I had been saying that I wanted to do this for so long. We finally got that opportunity. So what this picture shows is the first houseboat that we purchased for €1, a symbolic amount. And it wasn't in very good shape. Most of these buildings were destined for demolition. So this is an example of how you can take kind of waste land, waste buildings, waste materials, and combine everything into added value. We had to very quickly begin stockpiling materials and figuring out how to prototype renewable, various types of clean technologies for the site. So we had to get a workshop. We designed a lot of our own electronic systems because we wanted to do resource monitoring, so air quality and waste generation, energy, etc. And we also engaged the whole community that would be renting on the site. So it's actually a commercial, it's a creative office park. There's no residences, but we engaged all the renters in building their own clean tech systems. So these are actually people building their own water filtration systems. And finally, the moment came when the buildings were craned on land, which was around 2 years ago. So the boats were actually moved onto the land. This was soon after the buildings had been craned on site, so starting slowly to look like the render I showed. And now the site has actually become one of the hotspots of Amsterdam. It attracts many visitors internationally as well. There's 30 companies based on the site with their headquarters, and there's a bustling cafe that attracts a lot of attention. I guess the important thing about this is that, okay, this was a strange location, a small sort of starting experiment, but we used it as a kernel for broader transformation, because we used these systemic underpinnings and a lot of stakeholder work to actually set up larger transition factors. This was we conducted a research program on site together with the local water utility to actually show what happens if you do decentralized sanitation and wastewater treatment. This is actually a picture of struvite. We're recovering it from the urine on site, so it's actually chemical phosphorus, and many of you may know that globally we have a nutrient cycling issue. So on site we've been showing how you can actually recover nutrients for safe reuse in food production, which is then served back at the cafe. And this is one of a unique feature that hasn't, these things haven't really been done generally, but we're trying to show that it is technically possible. And as a result of this small experiment that started at De Kovel, this was an event at one of the podia in Amsterdam around a year and a half ago. There was interest from the water utility and from other organizations to scale this up to the whole neighborhood that De Kovel is located in. So that actually initiated the circular Bouwsloterham project. This is a picture of waste flows in Amsterdam in their current form and how they're traveling. And this is a picture of how they could travel, what the potential is, even with existing technologies, to circularize those flows and actually extract value from across this whole chain. And it was with this sort of systemic perspective that we set off to analyze the whole neighborhood around De Kovel. So if I had a pointer, I could show you where De Kovel is on this map. It's in this area, a post-industrial sort of zone, just to the north of Amsterdam Central Station. This is what it looked like in the 1970s, and this is roughly what it looks like now. A lot of polluted plots, just like De Kovel. And this is the prime area for real estate expansion for the city of Amsterdam, which continues to grow and has actually a housing shortage. And so it's actually a very unique opportunity to reimagine how these types of urban developments should go if you want to design a city that is systemically different and it's actually functioning in a circular way. So I'm going to just show a few more things quickly. So we did all of this modeling for the area to look at what it would look like according to a business as usual scenario versus a sort of alternative circular pathway. A lot of spatial mapping, our sort of traditional Sankey diagrams which show where the different resource flows are coming from. And this eventually, and not to mention a lot of stakeholder work with 400 stakeholders from the local area. And this eventually led to these roadmaps that are actually calculated based on what can be achieved in the area. And that was conducted for the entire site. After this project was conducted, this theoretical analysis, what has happened since is that 24 key stakeholders from the municipality, including all the utilities, major businesses, and local government, have signed on to actually execute the plan according to this vision. So that happened earlier this year, and now various working groups have been formed to actually bring it, to actually execute this and realize it. And so I guess this started from a small experiment, but if you bring these systemic underpinnings into how you think about things, and if you also laser in on where are the points of leverage within a broader system, you can actually move towards transition in a faster way than you would otherwise. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Eva. Fascinating example of how you can actually put these systemic ideas into practice. Now, on to our next speaker, and we're going to hear now about how to make cities livable. So Mark talked about the research visit to Bristol, asking people why they like living here, and that edginess, I think, is something that we all know, but we find quite difficult to define and certainly to put into words. So let's welcome now Brent Toderian from Vancouver, and he will look at making cities livable. Brent.
Thank you, everyone. Last night we had a whole panel to talk about livability. Now I'm supposed to talk about a rather robust subject matter in just a few minutes, and so I'll do my best. Last night we started the conversation with the observation that a survey had been done in almost about half of I'm not sure if it was UK or Bristol, was saying they were thinking that cities in the future were going to be less livable. And there is something to be said for the idea that there appears to be threats to our livability in urban places, not the least of which is climate change, which is not a far away thing. It's a thing that is affecting cities right now. And also, obviously, challenges associated with global war and terrorism that are not only creating fear of living in cities, but also putting stresses on cities to take growth in a more rapid and rather abrupt way. So all these things can seem to be challenges, but I think what that survey really spoke to was not about climate change or war, it was about growth. There's a general feeling that as we grow, we're going to get less livable. So my answer to the question that we were asked to respond to, the one thing that would be different in our cities moving forward that I would want to see is that the conversation change around how we can be more dense and more livable at the same time. That livability is not achieved through the absence or the avoidance of densification. But when you do what I call density done well, you can grow your city in population and in scale and do it in a way that actually adds to your livability. And there's plenty of evidence of that in smart cities around the world, not the least of which is my city that I formerly planned for, Vancouver, which is an increasingly densifying city by design, as we call it, but also routinely ranked as one of the most livable cities in the world. And I note, by the way, that we have 3, if you believe The Economist magazine, and Enid, that was the source of my reference around economists, but The Economist magazine does rankings of livability, and Canada has 3 of the top 10 most livable cities, according to The Economist magazine, if you accept their methodology. And it does, perhaps that explains why I'm following another Canadian in Enid. I'm used to be the token Canadian in an international group, and here we are, 2 of us, Enid. And possibly that's because your offspring, your Commonwealth offspring, seem to be doing better at livable cities than you, at least if you believe economists. So when I talk about density done well, I do a whole masterclass on density done well, but I'll sum it up with 3 components. One is thinking multimodally and actually deprioritizing the car. I'll talk about that in a second. The second is building amenity into your density as you build, and even leveraging density to pay for amenity that cities can't normally afford. There's the money thing, Enid. And the last piece is having a very high quality standard of design. That should go without saying, but it's amazing how willing cities cities are to accept poor or even average density or design as we densify, which tends to turn the public quite rightly against density. I referenced last night what I call the Montparnasse effect when it comes to tall towers, if you know the Montparnasse Tower in Paris. And I often say, if that's what I was told a tall tower would be like in my neighborhood, I would hate tall towers too. So we tend to have we do the densification conversation a disservice by allowing at best average design and at often quite poor design. So those three components of what I call density done well are key. But when I talk about the components of livability, last night I went through a longer list, so that's why I'm not going to talk about green and people, places, and healthy cities and economy tonight, but I'm going to focus on just a couple. One is this idea of you cannot be livable and you cannot densify in a livable way if you continue to prioritize the car. This is something I think Bristol understands. Some of the most interesting examples of tearing out roads and returning public places in your what's it called, College Green and Queen Square and such, rather remarkable examples. But we still have cities, and particularly suburbs. And I was shown Bristol's inner city. I was not shown Bristol's suburbs. And I suspect your suburbs are as horrible as suburbs everywhere in the world. And our success and failure as city regions will depend on how well we do our suburbs, not how well we improve our inner city. But when I was shown those, or what I was seeing, I was very impressed. But I still felt that there was still work to be done in terms of taming the car. And I want to make it clear that my perspective on cities is that you can design cities for people without banning the car. One of the cities I've been advising for, Oslo, Norway, has just announced that by 2020 they're going to ban the car from the center city. I prefer cities that deprioritize and tame the car. I don't believe it's necessary or even smart to ban the car, except in strategic places like pedestrian streets and in public places like you have where you've taken out car infrastructure. But I think it's about constantly augmenting civic life and deprioritizing the car so the car is present but not dominant. To me, that is the key to a more livable city. And then cars can exist, but they don't take over. The second piece, and by the way, to do that means you can have conversations about balancing the car. I call balancing, in this context, code for the status quo, only slightly better. Because what you tend to get, the car has a head start. The car has 40 years of a head start. Even if your goal is to balance, by definition, you have to prioritize walking, biking, and something you need to work on, public transit, in order to even allow it to catch up. But in truly livable cities, there isn't even a balance. Walking, biking, and transit is dominant in urban settings. The second aspect is what I talked about last night, this idea of a lovable city. You mentioned edginess. To me, this is part of can you be a city that's more than just livable? It's also interesting. It's also vibrant. It's also designed in delight and surprise and energy and all these kinds of things that make cities not just livable but also interesting. So we're starting to have this interesting discourse about whether you can be livable if you're not lovable. I'm not quite sure it's quite that black and white, but there's something to the idea that leading a good life doesn't just mean you have a heartbeat. Leading a good life means you have an exciting and interesting life, and there's something about that idea in cities too. I'm going to end, how am I doing for time? I'm going to end with a few thoughts on the how, because I often say that we get together and we talk about the what we want. We want more livable cities. The hard part, over and above money, is the how. And what I find when I'm asked to advise cities is they often bring me in initially to talk about content, the what, and we invariably end up spending most of our energy, or at least a lot of our energy, on the how, because the what is kind of the easy part. Most of us who understand cities get the what, but the how is in getting done. And what I say is that it's a combination of vision, which clearly a city like Bristol has, combined with great data, the evidence that Sir Mark was talking about, and combined, by the way, with great storytelling. I say the most powerful thing is having the data on your side, which it is. Everything we talk about building smarter, more livable cities, there is ample evidence to support the idea that this is not only right, but valuable in the context of money. But storytelling has to be part of it, because data can be mind-numbingly boring if you let it be. Whereas you can tell a fantastic story about how these things work through anecdote and through example and through experience. So always never forget the human side of that data, the storytelling. And then it's about will and skill. The cities that I work with that are innovative and successful are the ones that are getting on with it. And they have the political leadership or the civic leadership to actually do things instead of dithering and talking about them. They're stuck in what I call the 8 most frustrating words in the English language. We could never do that in our city. It's amazing how much energy goes into the culture of excuse, where Bristol will explain to me why something that I'm talking about isn't possible here because of fill in the blank. The government system, climate, slope, whatever it is, whereas the cities that are doing it are the ones that are not buying into that culture of excuse. They're getting on with it. So I'll stop there, and we'll see how the conversation goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Can you be livable if you're not lovable, or even the other way around, I guess, is a question we could ask ourselves. We're going to have our panel discussion in 10 minutes' time, so hold the questions that you may have had coming up in your mind as you've been hearing our earlier speakers. Our final speaker is Charlie Catlett, and he's from the Argonne National Laboratory in the University of Chicago, talking about cities and the array of things. Charlie, over to you.
I'm setting my timer here for 9 minutes, so you'll all know if I go over. Well, I must say I was really inspired, Sir Mark, by your talk. There are a few things. First of all, I'm from Argonne National Laboratory, which is a Department of Energy laboratory in the U.S., just outside of Chicago, and I'm also at the University of Chicago. And we do a lot with the city of Chicago and other cities. But I'm doing a couple of other things that really, in some sense, we are trying to follow in the footsteps of some of the work that you've done here in trying to understand what are the needs of cities across the United States. With one of my activities, I work leading 10 Department of Energy laboratories, sitting down with cities over the last 2 years and having similar summits to what Sir Mark described, to sit down and say, tell us what are your challenges, and then we try to map those to the kind of research that we do to find places where we can do research that is both good from a scientific point of view, but it's also relevant to cities. The other thing I've been spending a lot of time in the last year doing is participating in a working group that's been organized by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in the U.S. on the future of cities. And we've been interviewing on a weekly basis experts and academics and city officials to try to figure out where do cities need to be in 50 years' time, and what is the role of the federal government in terms of policy and research and development in helping cities to get there. I'm going to have to put my reading glasses on to see my notes here. So some of the things that we've talked about as we've had these meetings with cities is we've seen a couple of themes about the next 50 years of cities, and we've sort of summarized them as three different attributes that we want to try to move toward. One is green cities, which has to do with sustainability and resilience. A second is fluid cities, which has to do with the movement of people and goods through cities. And the third is enabling cities, which is our code word for cities that allow people the same opportunity regardless of where they live in the city. So in other words, cities that actually work for everyone and not just people in certain parts of the city. Now, when I was about 10 years old, I remember watching my uncle Chuck was tuning his car. This is something that used to do 40 years ago, where he was looking at the gaps in the spark plugs and he was replacing these wires and stuff. He turned to me and he said, "Hey, watch what I'm doing, because this is going to save you money when you get your own car." Well, I never tuned a car because you don't tune cars anymore. But it's an illustration from my point of view of why cities need to think about technology and to be instrumented, more than just the issue of parking or traffic flow, but using data and using that data effectively to make the city work better. So today's cars have 400 sensors in them. and they are starting to move to the point where they're autonomous. And so one might ask, what does not the connected autonomous vehicle look like of the future, but what does a connected autonomous city look like? We have done in the city of Chicago a number of data analytics projects where we've helped the city take the data that they have, and cities are drowning in data right now, but they're drowning in the sense of sitting in a life raft in the middle of an ocean of salt water, not being able to drink that water. So they're drowning in data on the one hand, but on the other hand, they don't have the tools that they need to work with the data. Two projects in Chicago that we've worked on have to do with this, using data to make the city work better. So one is use of predictive analytics. So one has to do with public safety and specifically food safety. We found that there are something like 40 different leading indicators to a food safety violation in a restaurant. And so if you take those 40 leading indicators, if you're just looking at them as a human, you could probably figure out what's happening, and you could probably predict whether one restaurant or the other is going to have a food safety violation. But if you're the city of Chicago, you have 15,000 food establishments and 32 inspectors. So how do you get through those in a year? What we did in Chicago was we used those leading indicators to rank order restaurants according to risk, and rather than randomly inspect, we sent inspectors to the riskiest places first, without telling them in this 60-day double-blind trial. At the end of 60 days, sending one set of inspectors on an ordered rank-ordered list and the other on the typical random, at the end of 60 days, we found that the rank-ordered list was finding food safety violations on average 7.4 days before the random inspection. So it doesn't sound like a lot unless you're one of those people that got food poisoning in that week's time of delay. The second, I think, is an illustration not just of safety, but an illustration of how data can make cities more equitable to people in cities. 311 is a non-emergency service request in Chicago and other cities. I don't know what the number is in the UK, but 311 is what you call if you report graffiti or abandoned vehicles or standing water, spilled garbage, etc. In Chicago, we have a problem, as I suspect you might in Bristol, with rats. And the rat inspectors, the ones with that go out with traps and baits, would typically go out in most cities based on complaints to 311. If you look at a map of 311 complaints across any city, you'll find that the most wealthy parts of the cities tend to have the most problems, or at least you would think that if you just looked at who was calling 311. Some parts of Chicago, you're not likely to call 311 because you're too worried about the stuff you call 911 about, like theft or robbery or assault. What we found in the city of Chicago as we started to move toward predictive analytics, we found 31 leading indicators for rat infestation. We said, let's send the inspectors out where rats are likely to breed over the next week. And now if you look at the map of where the rat inspectors are going in Chicago, it's much more evenly spread across the city, to the point that the person in charge of the rat patrol, they call themselves, said recently that she found a rat infestation in part of the city of Chicago worse than she had ever seen in her career. And it was in a part of the city where there was nobody going to call 311. So we use data analytics not just to make the city work better, but also to work better for people. Now, as we were working with the city of Chicago on data analytics, we found that there were a lot of questions about a city for which we didn't have data that we needed. For example, in a neighborhood where we have a very high rate of asthma, right next to another neighborhood where we don't, or half a mile away. Now, part of asthma would come from the building stock, part of it would come from traffic patterns or from air quality. But if we only have one air quality monitor for the entire south side of Chicago, we don't have the data we need to diagnose why is air quality here particularly bad, and what can we do about it. Now, cities, I believe London has done this. I know Paris and Beijing have done traffic policies to overall reduce emissions. But we don't know how to reduce emissions in a particular neighborhood. So here's where, in the city of Chicago, here's where we started to think about instrumenting cities. If a car has 400 sensors, why wouldn't a city have a sensor system? If you look at EPA sensors throughout the city of Chicago, there are about 10 of them, 15 maybe. Across the city of Beijing, similarly, about 15 air quality measurement places. And the reason for that is severalfold, but most of the reason for that is cost. The scientific quality sensors, not the stuff you buy on the web for do-it-yourself, but scientific quality sensors for nitrogen dioxide, for particulate matter, for ozone, those are very expensive. Well, they're getting less expensive now. So we've got an experiment called the Array of Things in Chicago. That's a juxtaposition of two terms. One is an array telescope, which is a set of instruments that are pointed, in most cases, at the sky. It's a telescope. And collectively, they give a much better picture of the sky than any one of them would individually. So that means I got 1 minute left. So we put that on top of the Internet of Things. What we have in Chicago that we're going to start deploying in March are devices not much larger than that exit sign over there, much better looking than that will sit on street corners, on traffic signal poles about 12 feet off the ground. And they will collect 8 different gases plus particulate matter. They'll collect temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, vibration. And they will have cameras pointed both straight up and at the street surface, where we'll use image processing within the box. Again, with the new technologies, we can actually put what 10 years ago was a supercomputer inside these boxes. So we do all of the image processing within the box, looking for surface flooding, looking for counting pedestrians. The camera have the resolution where we could actually say, count the pedestrians and tell us which ones are not wearing helmets and how many. But for privacy reasons, all of that image processing happens on the box, and then all of the data is published freely and openly. So the entire project is not about the city watching you, but about you watching the city. And the culture of the project, which is a partnership between the city, Argonne National Laboratory, University of Chicago, and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, is to make these devices a public utility in the neighborhood, where now imagine I'm walking through a city like Chicago, and just as I can look on here, I took 12,000 steps yesterday because I'm wearing one of those Fitbits. Imagine if I can look on here and say, show me in the last week my exposure to carbon monoxide or excessive noise, and then show me the map where that took place. So I can plan my route based on air quality, or I could plan my route based on noise, or maybe based on just the most activity in the city by action on the street. So that's our project. We should have 500 of these up on the streets of Chicago within 18 months. And we've got 15 city partners that we're working with who want to pilot these, including the city of Bristol. So thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. That sounds fascinating. One of the things that's happening this afternoon, this evening, is that the Data Dome, which you will know as the Planetarium at Bristol, is being launched, and all sorts of things, including the products of the Array of Things, can be transmitted and projected onto the ceiling in 3D. And once you're in there, it's amazing that we've made some short films which just test out the ideas. For example, the amount of electricity that's produced from the solar PV that's on the roof at Bristol, and the way that looks across as it's generated across the city in other arrays, and the clarity you get from that. Just seeing it in that 3D dome above your head in a planetarium is just wonderful. So it'd be great to see some of that data appearing there. Can I ask all of our panel, our speakers, to come up on the stage and join me for the panel? Just take a random seat. I fear I'm going to have to stand here in order to spot who's got questions.
Oh, hi there. My name's Blaze Kelly. Excuse me. I'm from a website called whatsthecost.info. And it's a question mainly at Enid regarding one of your opening statements. I suspect it was slightly tongue-in-cheek. It was, you're an economist, so you're not going to talk about quality of life. But in my experience, that's often the case with economists. I'll just read a quote from an OECD report on the cost of air pollution and the health impacts of road transport. It's money is not the thing being measured, but the instrument in which we choose to measure it. And there's a huge amount of work on the external costs of things like congestion, noise, infrastructure. And as Brent says, this helps to tell a story and to pull the whole picture together. And I think a lot of the UK's problems are because we've been run by economists, and ironically, we're literally paying the price for it now.
I did say it tongue-in-cheek because
She was quoting me.
I was actually quoting Brent. Brent last night was talking about, and he did it today, the quality of life surveys done by Economist magazine, and he said jokingly, who would ask economists are the last people I'd ask about quality of life, and so
It wasn't a joke.
I don't disagree with what you've said. I am an economist, and I'm not going to apologize for that. But my area is municipal finance and governance, and so the way I look at things is look at what people want in their cities. What kind of services do they want? What kind of infrastructure do they want? And then talk about how we get there. So I don't take the job of what do we want, what kinds of services. I leave that to people in cities, and then figure out how they can get them and how they're going to pay for it.
Can I just add, I should point out that I would be equally critical of my own profession in town planning. I wouldn't necessarily ask town planners for a definition of quality of life at times. I can be equally, if not more, critical of my own profession. But I think the thing to remember, I have increasingly come to love math. It was my least favorite subject in school. But I'm realizing the power of it when it's combined with storytelling, because when we talk about the full cost of things, suburban sprawl versus inner city infill, for example, multimodal transportation versus car dependency, the math associated with that is powerful, and it will convince any politician, right wing or left wing, to think about things differently, more so than any warm and fuzzy conversation will. So I've embraced the power of the tool of the economist, the math, and used it in a powerful way. And to give the mathematicians and the economists credit, increasingly they're counting more things. The problem with economics and other math-based things is they weren't counting enough things. We weren't close to full cost accounting, so the conclusions were flawed. But then, of course, so it's good that we're doing far more full cost accounting of things. But even if you could count everything, there's the line that says, not everything that counts can be counted. And so there's an awful lot about quality of life that no one will ever be able to quantify, because there's a qualitative part of city making. It's as much art as it is science.
Let me just add one more thing, and I think we should move on from economists. How we pay for services is not just about getting revenues, but it affects how our cities look. And, we all, as planners, go out there and say, oh, we hate urban sprawl. And so we're going to do all kinds of zoning and all kinds of policies so that we don't have urban sprawl. But how we pay for services has a real impact on whether we have sprawl or not. So, for example, if we have charges on new developments to pay for infrastructure, as we do in the North American context, if we charge everybody the same amount for infrastructure, whether they're close to existing services or further away, a rational developer is going to locate perhaps further away where it's greener and nicer. But if we charge according to the cost they impose on the municipality for providing infrastructure, you're going to have more rational decisions. You're going to have, not more rational, but rational decisions that lead developers to locate close to existing services. So you can zone, you can't do this, you can't do that. But the way you charge for services will impact where the development occurs. And so don't underestimate the role of economists in making our cities work.
Can I just challenge the premise of the question, actually? Because the truth is we're not run by economists. We're actually living great democracies, and I think this week we should be particularly proud of that.
So, Mark, one thing I was fascinated by was your 7 lessons. Is there one of those that's a complete disaster if it's missing, or are they all co-equal?
Well, it comes back to the point I think that everyone's made, really, which is that unless we take a systems approach, we're not going to get the best answers. And it actually is about systems engineering in a way. Not that I'm proposing that we should be run by systems engineers either. But I think what we've just heard, the experiments that are being done in Chicago, and of course Steve Koonin in New York is running something very similar. There are similar activities here. and I was struck actually by the factors that determine where the rats are might have also been similar to the facts that determine which restaurants you should inspect.
Martin Bigg from the University of the West of England and Bristol Green Capital Partnership. I'd like to pick up something that most speakers have mentioned, in the sense of we are seeking to deliver livable, lovable cities. But are we really focusing on our city centres and failing to pick up our sprawling suburbs, the somewhat depressing areas that we see around many of our cities, whether it's Amsterdam or Prague? And similarly, are we depriving our surrounding towns from attention? Alternatively, are we coming up with solutions which are equally applicable in those places?
Thank you. Who wants to answer that? Charlie?
A lot of what we do in our work with the city of Chicago, we think about replicating those technical tools, not necessarily urban solutions, but technical tools, in two different ways. One, if you're a city like Chicago or Bristol, 100,000, I think Bristol's at least 100,000 or more, you probably have some level of capability to work with data. So we want to make solutions that allow those cities to easily replicate those solutions, so whether it's a data portal technology or a sensor technology. The second way we think about replication is in the smaller cities, the 50,000 person or 80,000 person cities. And there, we've been working with the city of Chicago to say, since we're building, for example, a data analytics platform for the city of Chicago, why not host the data for smaller cities around the Midwest and provide the same tools to them that we use for the city of Chicago, whether it's the restaurant inspection algorithms and optimization or something else. Because the incremental cost to Chicago of adding the data for Peoria or Springfield or Indianapolis is very small. And so we've sort of thought about very, very carefully about the fact that in the U.S., the 20,000 or so cities, only a very, very small handful are the New Yorks or the Chicagos. So the really question is, how can we take those solutions from the few large cities and make them replicable across tens of thousands of cities?
A friend of mine, a professor at Queen's University in Canada, did a study challenging this common narrative that we are now an urban nation in Canada, urban planet. That the statement that for the first time ever we are more urban than rural, as if those are the only two choices. What the study found is that Canada is predominantly a suburban nation. So is the United States. I suspect so is UK, in the context of where most people live and where still most people are going. So we can do our inner cities almost perfectly and still lose the battle, particularly around climate change and sustainability, which to me is one of the largest battles that we as city makers and region makers have to tackle. So I'm careful to differentiate suburbia from sprawl. Not all suburbs are sprawl, but too much of them are. And the key principle or the key determinant of sprawl is separated autodependency. And you can do transit-oriented suburbia. We do it in Vancouver. In Metro Vancouver. You can have walkable suburbs. We did it before the 1960s. We could do it after. So I think at least half of our attention, if not the majority of our attention as smart city makers, as people concerned about national economies and such, has to go into a better suburb. Not eradicating the suburbs, because that won't happen, but smartening them up. Because our battles will be won or lost based on the success of that challenge, which is the key challenge of our generation, I say.
Hi, I'm Irena Baumann, architect. I found your presentation fantastic. Eva, the ideas you are speaking of are truly disruptive. And I want to connect what Brent said about quality of design to your approach, because the concept of quality of design, I think, is changing. And I just wonder whether both of you could say a little bit about what you consider to be quality of design.
Okay.
All right. Well, actually, that was one of your initial comments, so I think...
I can start if you like.
No worries. Indeed, I think a big aspect of livability, just as a citizen, is actually found in quality of design. Because if you're walking through a cityscape and you see repetitive buildings and or like a poorly designed infrastructure, it affects you psychologically. One of the things, I'm not a designer actually. By training, I'm a molecular biologist and then something called an industrial ecologist. And actually, a lot of what the work that we do, we work with a lot of designers. We actually think of kind of the rules of the system. So the frameworks that you have to put in place that can actually lead to the right kinds of designs emerging. And that's actually, I think that goes back to a lot of what's been said so far about economics, because it's the rules and the structures that you put in place that then determine what can the emergent sort of functions and emergent designs that can occur in a certain area, and that's actually where I'm most interested in influencing design. There's a development outside of Almere in the Netherlands called Oosterwolde, and it's actually it's a greenfield area that has been selected as a development site because of housing shortages. But what has been done that's very interesting there is that they've created a sort of rule set that inside this Oosterwolde zone, only certain kinds of things can be built. Waste cannot be exported or imported. Renewable energy is the absolute requirement for any development in the zone. And this actually creates a sort of framework for design to take place in a different way.
I think the expectation of circularity as well helps. So there's a big anaerobic digestion plant just outside Bristol at Avonmouth, which when we first started talking about it, nobody could imagine where all of the waste would come from. But it's not quite if you build it, they will come. But you can demonstrate that the demand is there, and then the systems will come together, and that plant is now producing more electricity than it ever has before. Brent, you were going to add on.
So Mark talked about systems engineering. I like to also talk about design thinking, which is a whole different way of tackling problems. I tend to say that almost no matter what question you ask, part of the answer is better design. That includes climate change, that includes more responsible approaches to technology, value. I did some work for the City of Sydney, Australia, for the Lord Mayor there, who wanted to make the case that design is not aesthetics. Design is not something that's nice to have if you can afford it, if you have some spare budget to apply to design. The line I use is beauty outperforms ugly in almost every way you can measure. And it's amazing how expensive ugly is, both in initial cost and long-term cost. So the conversation, so when we talk about city making, Vancouver's been called a city by design for decades now. And it's not to be because that makes us just feel good. It's part of the economic success of the city. It's part of the responsible, resilient success of the city in just about every way you can measure.
I think it's very important, though, to distinguish when talking about design between design for aesthetics and design for functionality. And you say like a city by design. Another thing that's a big topic of discussion is, of course, top down and bottom up, and also process driven solutions versus predetermined solutions. And one of the things that I think is most important in planning for resilient adaptive cities is to actually create space for things to evolve and change according to a certain framework. And that's what I was talking about in terms of setting the rules correctly, rather than pre-deciding, okay, this is going to be a commercial zone and this is going to be a residential zone, because I think that's where we get into issues that you can't predict what a city should look like in 20, 50 years. So,
Great.
But a commercial zone will look completely different. I mean, you can have a factory in a building this size. I mean, the whole nature of work is going to change, and the ability to integrate it with living and playing is going to be the critical way forward.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that what characterizes old cities that have really high quality is that they were able to evolve to what was needed at the time. So you have these old city centers have this kind of delightful randomness and have filled in with whatever functions were necessary. But yeah.
Question right on the back row there.
Colin Taylor, University of Bristol. I'm the university theme leader on future cities and communities. My question is, are we developing enough people who are systems thinkers, systems designers, systems doers, and in particular have the ability to lead systems thinking, systems design, and systems doing at all levels, not just at senior city levels, but actually at the doing levels.
Thanks. So Mark has the
So there's
answer.
an easy answer to that. You work in a great university. That's what university is about. You have the power to develop the courses that will enable that to happen. Are you doing it? And at a scale that matters.
My point is, it's not just at university level, it's got to be at schools levels and in practice throughout the age groups. If we don't have people who have the capability to do all this stuff, we won't be able to use the technologies and other thinkings properly.
Well, I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure that you are reaching out to schools, which is one of the important things that a university does.
So I think our final question just in front of you there. We'll bring
Thank
things
you
to a
very
close.
much. My name is Janet Askew, and I am the president of the Royal Town Planning Institute, and I happen to live in Bristol as well. I'm just wondering if we're living in a kind of Western privileged bubble when we talk about these things, because livability seems to me to be a very good word, and it's a word I've been using a lot this year while I've been president, and I've cited many times in my talks all around the world. I've just come in from China this morning just to be here. I've been citing Vancouver, Melbourne, and these places, and it seems that these cities really are trying very hard to turn things around and developing livable neighbourhoods. So my question really to the expert panel is, how much do you think that these ideas will filter to the really major problem cities in the world? The Shanghai, the Beijing. I've just come back from Guangzhou, 100 million population in the region of Guangzhou and Shenzhen. These places aren't going to turn around very quickly. On the one hand, they're still massively designing for the car because the car's so new to them. And on the other hand, hearing people from the West talk about livability strikes me as being slightly luxurious for us.
Who wants to take that?
I'll start. You mentioned Chinese cities. There's no part of the world that comes to study Vancouver more than Chinese cities, because we're the Pacific Rim gateway city with a half Asian descent population. And then they go back and they build the density without the livability. There's few things in my advocacy that have frustrated me more than that while I was 6 years as chief planner of Vancouver. I'm more optimistic about what's happening in other less luxurious cities. I've started to work in Latin America. And a lot of what I'm talking about creative cities and getting on with it, I've learned from working for the last few years in Medellin, Colombia, which has a different perspective on livability. 2 decades ago, they were the murder capital of the world, Pablo Escobar, guerrilla warfare. And so they would have laughed at this conversation about livability. And yet they have taken back their city. They've taken back their public realm. They've built remarkable public transit. Their motto is a city for life. And the Wall Street Journal last year called them the most innovative city in the world. So, and they hired me, and when I asked them, I said, why are you interested in learning from Vancouver originally? And I didn't realize till I got there how much the commonality of conversation really is. So my main answer to you is that every city in every part of the world can learn from each other in this common conversation about cities, and we actually have more in common than we have differences.
Well, I mean, I suppose the first observation is that around the world people are moving into cities because they are for them more livable than the places that they're coming from. That's the first thing to say. And secondly, of course, the priorities may be slightly different, though not that different. So air quality is a huge issue in China. It's an area where UK scientists and Chinese scientists are working together very closely. I'm off from here to Delhi. Discussions between the UK and India about cities are very active at the moment. And so every city faces different problems. And of course, we don't really have any of the mega cities in the UK. London is the nearest to that. But we all have to learn from each other. And cities are where people are living. They're increasingly going to live. And I would reiterate the point, I think we have to learn from each other.
Well, I'd like to say that we have learnt a lot from each other in here in this hour and a half. So would you like to thank the panel, please, our experts?